Good evening and welcome to another episode of SlantCast, the official podcast of Slant Books. My name is Gregory Wolfe and I am Slant's publisher and editor. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we're privileged to participate in a beautiful and bittersweet event, the posthumous book launch for Searching for Home, the final poetry collection by Robert Pack. I never had the pleasure of meeting Bob Pack in person, but my friendship with one of tonight's presenters, Paul Mariani, meant that I often heard about him, always in the context of an intense and joyful friendship. Thanks to Paul, Bob asked if Slant would be willing to publish Searching for Home. I was honored to be asked and honored to accept. Working with Bob on the collection was always bracing and fun. And it seems entirely right and just that he was able to complete his edits on the manuscript just days before he passed in June at the age of 94. But before we get started, just a brief word about Slant Books. How does one talk about a publisher called Slant? The answer is obvious: in a slantwise fashion. Sometimes that's best achieved by quoting someone else rather than attempting to speak in one's own voice. To encounter an echo, a resonance, a kindred spirit out there who seems to share the same vision. Along those lines, I recently came across a piece by New Yorker critic James Wood, which contained an intriguing passage. It spoke to the concern that Slant often faces, that being a literary press means we're somehow labeled as elitist or hyper-intellectual. Wood writes, "We are now so convinced of the terrifying complexity of our culture that we tend to flatter those writers who grapple with it at all, certain that they must be very brilliant just to be attempting it. But Proust rightly said in Contre Sainte-Beuve that to say of a novelist he is very intelligent is no different from saying he loved his mother very much. It is no more than a given, a premise, a biological truism. Of course, fine novelists must be very intelligent, but we have become fixated on one kind of intelligence, the theoretical, the analytical, the cultural, and I would add here in my own voice, the political, at the expense of other kinds of intelligence, intelligence of form, of language, the knowledge of human relations and human motive." That's James Wood. And that's precisely what I want to say about Slant, that we are devoted to the intelligence of form, of language, the knowledge of human relations and human motive. This also resonates with the phrase I recently found in an essay by Garth Greenwell, that art is concerned, he said, with carrying out research into the human. That's become the tagline or motto for Slant. If you'd like to learn more about how we do research into the human, we invite you to visit our website, slantbooks.org. Tonight, we are blessed by the presence of several outstanding writers to help us launch Bob Pack's Searching for Home. The poets Paul Mariani, Richard Jackson, and Jane Scharl. It's even possible that later in the podcast, we might hear from one or two more writers amongst those who've gathered here tonight. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to remind you that if you have questions for the speakers about Bob or an anecdote about him, please feel free to speak up in the chat. I can't guarantee that we'll have time to share all of those, but I hope it will be possible. In any case, I will post a link to Slant's webpage for Searching for Home, where you will find several options for purchasing a copy of the book. I hope you'll tell all your friends. And now, because time is tight tonight, I'll be keeping the introductions of our speakers short and sweet. I grabbed these off the internet, so forgive me, folks, if they are slightly out of date. We're going to begin with Paul Mariani. Paul Mariani is the University Professor of English Emeritus at Boston College. He's the author of 20 books, including biographies of William Carlos Williams, John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Hart Crane, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Wallace Stevens. He has published 9 volumes of poetry, All That Will Be New, Ordinary Time, epitaphs for the journey, deaths and transfigurations, the great wheel, salvage operations, new and selected poems, prime mover, crossing, Cocytus, and timing devices. He is also the author of the spiritual memoir, 30 Days on Retreat with the Exercises of St. Ignatius, and The Mystery of It All, the Vocation of Poetry in the Twilight of Modernity. It is a great honor and delight to ask Paul to share some stories about his friendship with Bob Pack and to read perhaps, if you will, Paul, from a poem or two from the collection that struck you that you have a particular affection for. Paul, if you're ready, we would love to hear from you now.
I've known our friendship with Bob goes back over half a century. And it began with my first book on Gerard Manley Hopkins, and he called and he said, I like this book, and he invited me up to Middlebury where he was teaching. And we were friends all those years, all those long years, and I worked very closely with him on his last book, Searching for Home. I thought I'd read a poem that I wrote for him, which gives you a sense of what we saw, the friendship and the humor that we saw in each other. It's called Separated by 2,477 miles. I laughed with Bob Pack over the phone. So Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, Bob begins again, his voice relaxed, but as ready as Bach to pack a whammy. It's something 50 years of forth and back and forth have taught me, a way of paying for my sins. So he comes running down the mountain, headed for this circle of elders by some fire pit, waiting for whatever news he has for them. Well, we had some time to get the schmooze up there, he says, and I got good news and some bad news to share. The good news first. I haggle the commandments down to 10, and I'm already laughing as Bob waits, then kicks in with, the bad news is that thing about adultery still sticks. And then I'm laughing so hard, I'm drowning in my own guffaws, and he knows he's got me once again. And just so you really understand how Bob's tortured me with jokes all these years, there's the one about the wife who provokes her sick husband into seeing their specialist to discuss what's wrong with him. So the doc takes the husband inside and gives him a thorough examination, only to walk him back outside and ask the man's wife if they can talk. Then he tells her hubby will need some very special attention. He's depressed. His life's just ebbing. She hears the doc sigh. But you could help him by greeting him at the door each night with a sexy nightgown on, then cook a special dinner for his delight. And when hubby asks what went on, she says, you're going to die. Multiply such delicious jokes 100-fold, and you get the point. Sure, we've had a many serious talk as well, back in the day, at his home or mine or up in Frost's cabin in that breadloaf phase, when we were younger and poured our poems to rock the joint. And though we're bonded here on earth, you wrote, we see our laughing selves floating up beyond all ache, where we will grieve no more about such loss. So let's take away from all of this elegiac stuff our laughter, that high note that will last long after we're both gone, dear friend. Like those paired trombones you hear reverberating in those purple hills you have sung so often of, or those loon calls and ebbing trills of airy laughter, as on and on, like two rabbis, our blessed banter flows. And I'd like to read a short selection from Bob's latest book, Searching for Home. And I love the poem about his Uncle Phil, a rabbi in Russia who was forced to come here. It's called Searching for Home. And after the defeat of Germany, after my father's early death, while still attending Fieldston School, I'd often take the train to Brooklyn, where in a Jewish neighborhood, including the Orthodox, dressed all in black with uncut beards, lived my Uncle Phil, a fugitive from Russia. Phil resided there with his exiled wife, a professional librarian, and their two daughters, one a watercolorist and one a concert pianist. My Uncle Phil emphatically proclaimed that art is how we rise above mortality. Back in old Russia, Phil, an honored rabbi, led his own synagogue of worshippers to whom he could preach his reformist views, his heartfelt jeremiads condemning looting and the ravaging of Jewish village shops and stores, their merchandise of shawls and shirts, of boots and overcoats. But he came under scrutiny of the authorities. He wondered what God had in mind in so testing him, and he was horrified to see how some Jews turned against their being Jews when threatened or coerced. One night, a stranger at his door warned him he had to flee without delay because the inquisitors were coming to arrest him. While the moon still hid behind the clouds, he disappeared, not to be seen again. He fled into the Russian dark with only his Bible and his fears. Safe in remote America, he revised his surname to Kaplan, and Fievel became Phil. Phil's family came 1 year later, leaving behind their paintings, their candelabra, and their heirloom silverware. Phil was not able to regain his rabbi status or find a role to play in a new synagogue. So to support his family, he had to take a humbling job as salesman in the cutthroat garment industry. Right after we had morning tea, he'd pack 2 suitcases with sample dresses, but before he'd leave for work, he'd give his sermon on a passage from the Bible. Father Abraham, he lectured me, would never sacrifice his son. He knew in binding Isaac he could outbluff God, who then would have to back off from the test of Abraham's obedience. God wanted Abraham to be the one to seek the promised land. Sadly, I'd watch Phil lift the suitcases and disappear down the long flight of stairs. I had a dream the dresses all escaped from their confining suitcases and floated like ghosts out the open window into the windy street. Phil was amused when I retold my dream, and his wife Pearl joined our laughter heartily. And then just a short sonnet here. It's called Survival Sonnet. I'm 93. I'm blind. You speak of hope. My children live mute distances away. I search for consolation, and I grope for light, light unreplaceable for day. Do you know me? I'm Bob, a palindrome. You see me coming when you see me gone. And home is now the memory of home. I am the vanishing you fix upon. You say I can beat time by beating time. You say I can out-hum the humming bee and bring back mellow summer with a rhyme and float a fallen leaf back to its tree. I call to you for better or for worse. I am becomes I am. Long live rhymed verse.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, do you have any other recollections or stories you want to share? You've certainly not taken your full allotted amount of time. It's up to you.
Greg, was that addressed to me?
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Yes, okay.
I'm just saying you've got more time if you want it. Otherwise, we can carry on.
Oh, okay. Okay. There are so many. One time up at Bread Loaf on a porch, Bob collapsed from something, and there were a bunch of us on the porch, and I ran over to see how he was doing. I said, Bob, are you okay? And he said something to the effect that as long as free verse didn't get in the way, he'd be fine. And and he got up, and I said, he's going to be fine. Don't worry. But it was always like that. I mean, he was so smart. I mean, we could talk about, oh boy, you name it. It could be anything. I mean, he was always up on current events, what was going on in the Holy Land, what was going on in the United States, in the Senate, in the presidency. We could talk about Socrates. We could talk about Maimonides. We could talk Latin, Greek, whatever. I mean, it was just marvelous to be able to have those conversations. And Eileen my wife would say, she could hear me downstairs laughing. She said, that was Bob Pack, wasn't it? And yeah, I'd say, yeah, it was, hon. And he would always lift up your spirits. And this is at a time when he could not see anymore. He was just so brave, right up to the very end. Yeah. And his beautiful wife, Patty, what a blessing she was. And of course, his two children as well. So I could go on, Greg, but go ahead. Let Rick go do something.
Okay.
Hello,
Okay.
Rick.
Fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. And I guess it will go without saying, although maybe some of our other speakers will speak to this directly, but in the light of the events happening in the Middle East right now, there's an added poignance and heart-wrenching aspect, particularly if you think about the passage you just read, Paul. So I hope that we will all, have a thought to those things, and to the larger witness, the humanism, and the generosity of spirit that Bob exemplified in so many different ways. Richard Jackson is the author of 17 books of poems, including The Heart as Framed, New and Select Poems, as well as a book of prose poems, Dispatches. Other books include Where the Wind Comes From, Broken Horizons, Out of Place, Half-Lives, Petrarchan Poems, Unauthorized Autobiography, New and Selected Poems, and Heartwall.
I first met Bob, it was in 1971. It was my second year at Bread Loaf for the Bread Loaf School of English. I was getting an MA there. And he was teaching the only workshop I've ever had in my life. Because I went on to get degrees in literature. What I remember about that workshop is that his emphasis on form and structure. And outside of the workshop, as Paul said, he was an incredible conversationalist. Whatever you brought up, he was able to further it along. His emphasis on form and structure was really interesting. He said one time, you can't be a real poet unless you can write a sestina. So, of course, I went back to my room and picked up a few lines here and there and stumbled out with some sort of sestina that did end up in the first book. And I remember his jokes and puns, his talking about Freud especially. There was one time where we sat around inventing playful forms, and I wrote these down in an old notebook, which I found the other day. And three of the forms were was so playful. He wanted to write a hard of hearing echo sonnet, where the echoes kind of misheard what was being said, or a self-conscious sestina that forgot its inwards every once in a while. And another one was a villanelle that would have dreams of being an epic and keep trying to force itself out of the form. It's that kind of fun sense of form that I remember a lot of our conversations. And I remember his own sestina, which I've used a lot in classes, called The Thrasher and the Willow by the Lake. And you think, well, what type of a person would be writing a sestina with all the repetition? And of course, it came out to be his speaker was a serial killer. So it seemed to be the appropriate voice for a sestina. We also talked a lot about science. I had actually started off in engineering school and have kept up in science, and a lot of our conversation had to do with different scientific theories, but also about trees. I remember when I visited him, his house in Vermont once, he took me around showing the different trees that he had, and when he came down to Chattanooga, besides talking about opera, which was another passion, he also talked a lot about trees and wanted to go around my yard and figure out what kind of trees we had and which ones we should plant. And we did end up planting a good deal of them. The other thing is we both had a big influence on words from Wordsworth. And I actually wrote down some lines that I remember him speaking from Wordsworth, and which was, our destinies, our being's heart and home is with infinitude, and only there with hope it is, hope that can never die, effort and expectation and desire, and something evermore about to be. And he kept telling me, if you're going to be a writer, effort and expectation, that's what you need. I also got when I was doing this, a former student of mine from way back in the 80s, one of the times that Bob mentioned, came to Chattanooga, Charlie Scott, and he just sent me an email, I think it was last night or early this morning, and he said, I have such fine memories of Robert Pack and his trips down to Chattanooga. He was the first poet other than you to pull me aside and complimented me on my work. I also recall a wonderful drive with you and him and others to Athens, Georgia for a reading he gave at UGA. That's a memory from, what is it, 50, 60 years ago that still stuck with him. So what I wanted to do is, like Paul, I'm going to read a poem that I wrote, which was kind of an elegy for him, and then one or two of his shorter poems. So this poem is called Ghost Forest, and has an epigraph from a quote from him, the trees will die. And his first line comes from him, and the second last line, which includes the phrase world of worded things, also comes from him. And it's something I began when I was in North Carolina and looking at the decimation of some of the trees there, and also thinking of him up in Montana. So Ghost Forest. I dreamed we both moved through a windy mist, lost in a Carolina salt marsh, guided by wisps blinking ahead of us like fireflies. Constellations we couldn't recognize rose out over the closing sea. Striped trunks of trees and stumps like blunt thorns spotted the water. Ghost forest, they call it, for woodlands the rising seas have claimed. As a carapace of lies to deny the end of things. Your dream was to merge your words with trees. I think your tamarack knew how to begin again. How can we know what a salt marsh means to say? Here, it's the blur of notes from the marsh wren. There, it's the whistle through the dying white pine, their shadow disappearing with the seeds the birds need. It's our own ends we see ghosted now. Is your own end ending until it ended? A kind of song that only the trees linked beneath their roots must know. What happens then depends on what we believe. Maybe in the tamarack, or in sudden wisps of light we can't explain. This world of worded things, whose ghostly echoes both warn us and console. And kind of along those lines, there's a lot of poems in here I thought of possibly reading, and I thought of this one. I thought of self-deception and the first one in the Einstein sequence, but I think I'll read this one. It's called The River. Drifting along the smooth flowing river, a melody my Mozart murmuring on my lips, we watch the riverbank for browsing deer and otters on their muddy side. But I'm not sure I can recall who paddled with me in the bow. Her sunlit hair aglow, I did not know where the smooth river ends or what awaits us past the blue horizon's haze. A rainbow trout arced in the air before us, and still another arced behind. Water globes dripped from my paddle and caught the dazzle from the sun. The river flowed on in its own designated speed. She turned around to warn me that a rock protruded from the water up ahead. The slant light of the sun blazed on her face, and it obscured her features. And all that I saw was fear and disbelief, the downturn of her mouth, the disengagement of her sunken eyes. Another one might be this poem on the second page, Mind. It follows when the scrutinizing mind asks if it's free to choose and thus begin, or if it cannot know itself, is blind with groping thoughts, salvation, grace, and sin. It follows that a solitary star outleaps its orbit, unpredictable. The mind is what it is what we are. The mind swirls empty, then the mind whirls full. Again, mind follows its own following, choosing its earliest necessity. It sings the song that its ancestors sing, again, determined to be free. Fading forlorn, on angel wings again, it flows up, out, up, and away, and then. Now that last one, of course, was a sonnet, which is one of the things that he really loved, and he really emphasized in that first class that I had. So I'm going to pass it on to the next person.
Now, finally, as far as our formal program is concerned, I want to introduce our next poet to represent a younger generation. I thought it was really just going to be more meaningful if we talked about Bob's legacy. He was a teacher as well as a poet, and both aspects of his life and his vocation, made a huge impact on the world. And so I asked a wonderful young poet and playwright friend of mine, Jane Clark Scharl, to read the collection and see if it resonated with her, if she would share some of her thoughts. So I've done that, and this time I will not make the mistake of forgetting to introduce her properly. So Jane Clark Scharl is an American poet, playwright, and critic. Her poetry has appeared in many American and European outlets, including the BBC, the Hopkins Review, the New Ohio Review, the Hudson Review, the American Journal of Poetry, the Lamp Measure Review, and others. Her criticism has appeared in Dappled Things, Fair Forward, Plough Quarterly, and others. Her first verse drama, Sonnet les Matines, was published by Wise Blood Books in February 2023. She lives in Detroit with her husband and children. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks for inviting me to join this conversation. I was going to listen in on this, and then when you asked me to speak, that was just a really fun treat. So I don't have any anecdotes from Robert Pack because I never met him. And now listening to your, just reading the poems, you get that sense of him. So even if I hadn't heard your stories, I feel like if you'd asked me to describe him just from these poems, that's the person I was reading. So it's really lovely to hear from Richard and from Paul some of those stories about him as a person, and to hear that the humor in the poems was the humor of the man, because there's not always that parallel, and it's neat to hear that. The thing that I really want to look at is what Greg opened with is that intelligence. He's he's intelligent on a couple of different levels. So the poems that I wanted to pull out and read show that intelligence, that broad and diverse intelligence. One of them was Mind, which Richard just read for us. So I might actually read it again since we have a little bit of time, because it's really worth hearing a couple of times. But I want to start with one of the sections from that longer poem, the title poem, Searching for Home, which Paul read some of this one. I'm going to read a later section from it. So this is the Uncle Phil poem, just as a reminder. This is the 6th section of the poem. In my conflicted youth, said melancholy Phil by candlelight, I wanted to enroll in newly founded Hebrew University, whose board of governors included Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and Martin Buber, each the leading genius in his field. Einstein believed God was impersonal, the sum of nature's laws, the law of gravity, the curvature of space, the quantum leaps of light, the ratio of mass to energy. Amused, he would call the Hebrew god Der Alter, as if he were a character in a remembered fairy tale. Buber was Einstein's opposite. His penetrating I and thou assumed that one's relationship to God was personal, was intimate. Freud thought God was an illusion that fulfilled the need to feel protected and assuage the fear of death. When he was asked, what is the goal of psychotherapy, he quipped, to replace neurotic misery with ordinary unhappiness. Grim, yes, but still funny, still curative. Thanks, sympathetic Dr. Freud. We've got to make ourselves at home within the mind, Phil said, but also we have to make ourselves at home beneath the sun, among the wavering of leaves, across an undulating meadow and beyond a stream, a land of memories where Abraham is buried in a cave, where Moses found his conscience on a mountaintop. This is the land we now call Israel, named after renamed Jacob, who wrestled with God throughout the whirling night, and yet Jacob prevailed and received a blessing, and with dislocated hip, limped off into the everlasting dawn. That's not even the end of that poem. It's really a masterful poem. But the line that really leapt out to me there was, we've got to make ourselves at home within the mind, Phil said, but also we have to make ourselves at home beneath the sun, among the wavering of leaves. And I think that's what the whole collection is about, is finding those two homes, the home in the body and the home in the mind. And so the rest of the collection, to my reading, really guides us into making those two homes into somehow bringing them together and becoming one home. So when you read the Mind poem, which I will save because there's a couple of the ones I want to read. When you read that Mind poem that Richard just read to us, you can see that sort of his statement, to my reading, of how it feels to make a home within your mind. And then throughout the collection, there are a couple of recurring characters. You have Darwin and you have Einstein, which it's fun to see them come in and out. I wanted to read one from the Einstein selection, which I think is just really lovely. It's called Lost and Found. And it's part of a longer poem called Determining Einstein. It's section 7 of this longer poem. So the he here is Einstein. He left his Princeton office one fine day and headed home. No longer living in Berlin, he was confused and he had lost his way. Where was he still at heart a citizen? He managed somehow to contact the dean to ask if he had Albert Einstein's home address. He answered, not intending to be mean, "We don't give information to the press." And Einstein found himself remembering the Nazi persecution of the Jews, thug Hitler's fanatical murdering, Einstein abandoned his pacifist views. Incredible. Can evil such as this be true? My tormented thoughts are in a tempest world. What can the biblical Der Alter do? Does he play dice in a blaspheming world? Can we be free at home here in this universe? Is thought a blessing or is thought a curse? And I think that question there at the end, can we be free at home here in this universe? Is thought a blessing or is thought a curse? That's something I know I will sit with for many, many years, probably for the rest of my life, because that's kind of the whole game right there. So it's difficult I wish I could read you the whole collection, because that poem, it stands in this beautiful contrast with the Darwin poems, because you have Albert Einstein as this mind character, and then you have Darwin, who's investigating the body elements, and sort of the mindless universe, if that makes sense. So I think, Greg, do I have time to read one more? Okay, let me pick one Darwin one so that you can just kind of get a sense of how these two characters speak to each other across the collection. I'm going to read this one, and it's a little long, so bear with me. I might just read part of it so we don't run out of time. But this is from Quintessence of Darwin. It's called Darwin's Testament. When Darwin reached old age, after a lifelong malady that drained his strength and caused him nausea that interfered with innovative research on worms or barnacles or climbing plants, he'd ask his wife at evening by the fire to read to him out loud from a worn book. He was assured, concluded happily. Surely there was sufficient suffering in daily life, even for those who felt adversity can strengthen character, thus giving purpose to what might appear inscrutably evil, though such belief, congenial to human pride, did not, he knew, apply to animals who lack consoling words to ease starvation or the grip of a determined predator. Though evolution brought forth varied forms most beautiful to contemplate, a process Darwin described as having grandeur, his awed sense of nature's plenitude was superseded by the evidence of nature's cruelty and waste, and then confirmed beyond remaining doubt when his beloved Annie died of fever that parental care could not abate. At only 10 years old, without an outcry of protest by her to shake the smooth striation buried in the hills. And yet, it brought him joy to understand how natural selection could create uncanny patterns and resemblances, expressions of contentment or of fear on human faces everywhere across the separating continents, in children and in chimpanzees. That's not the whole poem, but it's a good place to stop. And then there is, as Greg pointed out, this really beautiful element that I was rereading this on the plane today, and since the war breaking out in the Middle East, it really does make this absolutely a vital collection to be reading right now, with those thoughts about mind and body and grieving and loss and the end, things ending. And then you look at what's happening in the world, and you it almost feels like he knew something was coming in an interesting way. You can get some senses of prophecy in it. So I'm, as a fairly new reader of this wonderful poet, I would just really encourage everybody to pick this up and get to know him, get to know that beautiful humor and the perception and the just the really wise and contemplative voice in this collection. And thank you to Greg for publishing this really special book.
Thank you, Jane. Really appreciate it. Listen, guys, we've got some bonus goodies here. A couple people who have joined us in the Zoom. knew Bob and are poets in their own right and have very kindly volunteered to share a little bit themselves. So I'd like to ask first Gary Margolis, a colleague of Bob's at Middlebury, if he would unmute himself and share. I know that Gary has written his own elegy or tribute poem to Bob Pack. So Gary, are you available to share that with us?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Hello, friends. Hello from Sperry Road in Cornwall, Vermont, down the road from where Bob and Patty and their 3 kids lived for so many years. And as Rick said, where so many trees were planted, so many ideas were planted, so many poems were written. As we're sitting here tonight, I'm remembering that when Bob had his heart surgery many years ago, he asked the anesthesiologist if, as he was coming out of anesthesia, if he could turn on the CD player that Bob had the surgery place on the gurney. He wanted to be able to hear Mozart as he was coming out of the anesthesia, and he didn't want to know whether or not he was on earth or in heaven. I met Bob 60 years ago when I was a freshman, a first-year student at Middlebury, and showed up in front of his office door one day at the encouragement of one of his students. I had no idea really what to say. I stood there. He looked at me and he said, "Do you play football?" And I said, "I do." He said, "Would you like to read some poems?" I said, "I'm not sure." And this poem recounts that first meeting. It's called Your Office Hours for Robert Pack. Here, you said, take these poems. Come back to talk when you've read them. Frost, Yeats, and one by Wallace Stevens, still a mystery. You knew I was a jock and not a poet until one night after practice, alone in my dorm room, I read every one of them and felt a feeling I didn't know I'd ever felt before. In the music, in their minds, the hearts of their ideas. I wanted to drop everything I wasn't doing, run in the middle of the night to your office for office hours, the smoke of a burning pipe. It was that long ago professors were still tamping down tobacco, lighting it in class, looking over their glasses at us, trying to guess what a line meant and how anyone could give a life to poetry, spend a lifetime deciding which words were better than none, trying to improve on a silence, a blank piece of paper, which suddenly, like the tight end I was waiting for the ball to reach my hands, I couldn't wait to write my first impossible poem to show another person, somebody I didn't know was you, who knew about end zones and first downs, knew when to send me away with a locker full of poems, when to call me back, to sit in a hallway, alone with myself, not having to imagine the day beyond us. We'd have nothing to write, nothing we couldn't revise.
Gary, thank you. How wonderful, how delightful. Really appreciate it. It's very kind of you to share that. And I wish I had known ahead of time, I would have introduced you properly, and I would have introduced our next person who I'm just thrilled has the opportunity to share a little bit, and that is the wonderful writer, Julia Alvarez. If you would unmute yourself, Julia, it would be just a delight to hear from you.
Okay, I figured it out. Thank you, Gregory, and everybody. Seeing some old friends, Paul Mariani, wow. Richard Jackson, I didn't think I'd lay eyes on you again. And Gary, of course, I see around here, but all of you, and names on here that I don't know, but I think we're joined by Bob Pack. Everything that you have read and said resonates deeply. I met Bob in 1969 when I was 9 American years old. That's the way I thought of it. I was 19, but I hadn't come into English till 1960. So I didn't feel like I really belonged in this class that I walked into, and we read The Silken Tent by Robert Frost. And so Bob said, so your homework is to go home and write a sonnet that is 1 sentence long and plays on a word like, Bob Pack, Robert Frost plays on different words in that poem. And I was ready to drop the class. So instead I went into his office and I said, well, I don't really know how to do this. And he just encouraged me and said, well, you just dive in. So I spent the whole weekend sweating bullets, and I wrote a sonnet, my first sonnet ever. And he really encouraged me. That's all I can say. And from then on, we had a long friendship. He was, as it's become clear, very, very, very generous. Every time that I've taught, and I feel like enough is enough, I've already given too much. I think, no, remember what Bob gave you, and you pass it on. You can't ever pay it back. So he's been a moral force in my head. His playfulness, a lot of you have recalled his laughter, his playfulness, which was always the last word. After the final no, there comes the yes of Bob's laughter. He loved Wallace Stevens. And he was curious, always wanting to know. I always called him on his birthday in May, and I did this year. And I was really happy because it was the last time I heard his voice. And he was so excited, Greg, about this collection coming out. And blind and ill. He had so many ideas, so many things he was writing about, but he always wanted to know what I was working on. And as I, mentioned my anguish over something, he would just say, well, just send it to me, and I thought, but you can't see. How can you read it? But no, he would find a way. So the generosity. And I've been looking through all his poems. I've got quite a stack here, looking through them today. And I remembered one poem. If it's not in the collection, Greg, but I would love to read his poem that was my favorite back then. And I had this thing that I did because I love to memorize poems, that when I had a friend, and Bob was my mentor, my muse, my friend, my teacher, and later my colleague. When I found a poem that they really liked, I would memorize it so they could always, in a conversation, turn to me and say, well, what do you have to say? I could just recite the poem for them. And this was a favorite of mine called The Boat. And I got very upset with him when the collected poems came out that it wasn't there in that collection. And he said, well, Julie, I couldn't include everything I've written. So may I read it? Greg, is
absolutely.
it okay? Even though it's
Absolutely.
not, it's called
okay.
The Boat. I've gotten old too, so I don't remember it by heart anymore. The Boat. I dressed my father in his little clothes, blue sailor suit, brass buttons on his coat. He asked me where the running water goes. Down to the sea, I said, set it afloat. Beside the stream he bent and raised the sail, uncurled the string, and launched the painted boat. White birds circling the mast wrenched his eyes pale. He leaped on the tight deck and took the wind. I watched the ship foam lurching in the gale and cried, "Come back! You don't know what you'll find." He steered. The ship grew, reddening the sky as waves throbbed back, blind stumbling after blind. The storm receded in his darkened eyes, and down he looked at me. A harbor rose. I asked, "What happens, Father, when you die?" He told me where the running water goes and dressed me gently in my little clothes. The sense of form, again, is so apparent there. So I didn't write a eulogy or a poem after Bob died because in some ways I feel like every poem I write has his fingerprints on it. And so he's in there in all of them. And he was a generous, wonderful teacher, writer, and a good example of how to rage against the dying light.
Well, bless you, Julia. Thank you for sharing those memories and thoughts and that wonderful poem. We're very grateful to you for taking the time. I know you had another event earlier in the day, so I know, but this meant enough for you to come straight on to us as well, and so I'm grateful. And in the last few moments,
a lot better. This one is a lot better.
Oh, great! I'm glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. And so, just because we have a couple minutes left, we do have a volunteer. Kurt Caswell, you've got a story. I think we can, if we just keep an eye on the length, please do share it, because I'm reveling in all the anecdotes and the humanity that's being portrayed here. Very three-dimensional portrait, I think, is emerging.
It's a brief story. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, indeed.
Great. So I too was a student at the Red Loaf School of English for 5 summers with Ray Harrison, who's in this room tonight. And we both studied with Bob, and he was the greatest teacher of my life. He didn't teach me so much how to write, but how to read, which I'll be forever grateful for. Anyway, so one day after class, a few of us gathered around Bob in the barn to talk about our papers, and we're kind of queuing up one after another to get some time with him. And he started with a mutual friend of Ray and mine, and she, sat down next to him and said immediately, "Oh, Bob, it's just all these papers and all this reading and all this work I have to do. And I have all these, obligations at home, and I'm so stressed out." And Bob, in that, dark, kind of gravelly voice that he has, he said, "Stress. I love stress. I eat it like a steak meal." And that for me captured, the essence of Bob, where he has this deep caring and love for people, but also this kind of booming power that I wanted, somehow for myself.
Wonderful, truly delightful. Well, I'm going to exercise executive privilege here as the moderator and read one myself. I just can't help it, because the last poem in the collection, which comes at the end of the multi-section poem on Einstein, ties a lot of things together, and I think sends us off in a beautiful way. It's actually called Der Alter's Legacy, and of course, as Jane used this phrase, Der Alter, I don't speak German, but I believe it's like the old one, right? And it's a word that can be thought of as relating to God, to Einstein, as you'll see, and of course to Bob himself. And so the fact that it's the last poem here in the collection just seems so perfect to me and a great way to send us off. Der Alter's legacy. Still, Einstein loved the biblical account, a father God who got creation right by balancing equations, numbers count, commencing with the words, "Let there be light." Reconciled son Hans arrived in time by plane to be beside his failing father, who, when he awoke, quipped, "I should have studied more geometry," a twinkle with the pleasure of his joke. He'd written an arousing speech to be read to celebrate Israel's anniversary, which was lying there composed beside his bed. He hoped to bring peace in his own century. One single life is quite enough for me, and nature's laws are comprehensible. That is their beauty and their mystery. My Jewish soul is satisfied. My father heart is full. I don't believe in immortality. What torment to eternally be young. Law must be grounded in necessity. His final words were in his mother tongue. His bedside nurse did not know what they meant, and so, by chance, his life's last words were spent. Thanks, one and all. I would also like to offer sincere, heartfelt thanks on behalf of Bob's wife, Patty, who has been so supportive throughout the process of publication. And I would be remiss here if I did not add thanks to the several people who worked with Bob directly in this last year to make this book possible, including Paul Mariani, John Glendenning, John S. Hunt, and Jim Zanz. Searching for Home is available for purchase in cloth-bound, paperback, and ebook editions through all major online retailers. If you go to the book's webpage at slantbooks.org, you can find links to several of those outlets, including bookshop.org. See the link in the chat box. The best way to keep up with our new and recent releases is to visit our website and sign up for Slantwise, our occasional e-newsletter. Just go right to the bottom of any webpage and you'll find where you can subscribe to Slantwise. You can also follow us on social media. Next month, we will publish Leaping from the Burning Train, A Poet's Journey of Faith by Jeannie Murray Walker. This is a book about a girl who left home without quite meaning to. One evening, doing her algebra homework, the 16-year-old abruptly realizes the tight-knit fundamentalist community she has been raised in may not have all the answers it claims to have. Then what to do with her familiar, immersive life, Sunday school, church, prayer meetings, vacation Bible school, mother-daughter banquets, midnight vigils, revivals, and car washes. In college, she discovers the language of poetry. It offers a path through metaphor and imagery that transcends the literalism and insularity of her childhood. Ahead of her lies a career as a poet, playwright, essayist, and teacher. Leaping from the Burning Train tells this story in loving and exuberant detail, without the self-righteousness that sometimes accompanies contemporary memoirs by those who have left conservative Christianity. Throughout her journey, including an early acquaintance with death and grief, the figurative language of poetry remains Jeannie Murray Walker's constant companion. And that language, over time, sustains her in a deepened, more authentic form of the faith she never abandoned. Tonight's event has been recorded and will soon be available on the Slant book page, our YouTube channel, and of course, through SlantCast. You can now subscribe to SlantCast through all the major podcast outlets, including Spotify, Apple, Audible, and many others. Please remember that none of this would be possible without your tax-deductible donations. You ensure that books like Searching for Home can be published and reach a world of readers hungry for literary, for craft, and enduring themes. Books that do research into the human. So to support our work, just go to slantbooks.org and click on Donate. Finally, remember to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thanks.